Remember when I recommended that women in Texas run away? Ladies, whatever you do, don't go to Oklahoma. The debate on whether or not a fetus is a child is a hot topic for more reasons than just the abortion issue. In an attempt to bolster their position on the abortion debate, pro-life activists seek to convince legislatures to redefine a child to include a fetus, resulting in laws that punish women for being pregnant. Currently, Oklahoma takes the prize for being the worst offender.
You're doing fine, Oklahoma, Oklahoma, okay.
Let's have a chat. Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me. Today, I'm looking at several articles on the same subject: the conviction of Brittany Pula of Lawton, Oklahoma, who was sentenced to 4 years in prison this month after a jury convicted her of first-degree manslaughter. Her crime? She had a miscarriage. I want to note that I realize that not all people who become pregnant are women. Nonetheless, I will be using the term woman to denote a pregnant person for the sake of brevity. According to the articles, Brittany sought medical help after suffering a miscarriage at home. The hospital ran a drug test on her as she reported in part of her medical history that she had used methamphetamines. Methamphetamines were found in her system. An autopsy was performed on the 17-week-old fetus that her body had expelled. It was inconclusive. The coroner said that the fetal demise could have been due to the methamphetamine found in the liver and brain, or it could have been due to genetic defect, or it could have been due to placental abruption. No cause of death was determined. Ms. Pula was charged with possession and use of methamphetamine, a misdemeanor. She was also charged with first-degree manslaughter, a felony. She remained in jail for 1.5 years awaiting trial as she couldn't afford bail. In any criminal case, there are elements of the crime. Each element of the crime is supposed to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt before a person can be convicted of the crime. If just one element of the crime is not proven, the defendant is supposed to be found not guilty. The elements are the minimum that one must do in order to have committed the offense that is being charged. Section 21-711 of the Oklahoma Penal Code defines first-degree manslaughter thusly: homicide is manslaughter in the first degree in the following cases: when perpetrated without a design to effect death by a person while engaged in the commission of a misdemeanor; when perpetrated without design to effect death and in heat of passion, but in a cruel and unusual manner, or by means of a dangerous weapon, unless it is committed under such circumstances as constitute excusable or justifiable homicide. 3. When perpetrated unnecessarily, either while resulting in an attempt of the person killed to commit a crime, or after such attempt shall have failed. The second and third definitions don't apply here. Let's concentrate on the first one. The fetus did die. Brittany did not design the death of her fetus. Brittany did commit a misdemeanor. But the key question is, did she affect the death of a person? Here's the rub. Pro-life people want to define all unborn as persons. But I'm going to set that aside for the moment, as the travesty of justice here should not have even reached this question, as there was another element missing. Did Brittany even affect a death? The evidence does not prove that she did. The coroner's report was inconclusive. How can one possibly be convicted on the evidence that one might have died as the consequences of the act of another? This would be akin to convicting someone of murder in the first degree if the defendant gave the victim a poisonous substance and the person died, but the autopsy cannot determine if the person died from the poison or not. Maybe he did is not beyond a reasonable doubt. So how was she convicted? According to a local television station, an expert witness for the prosecution testified at her one-day trial that methamphetamine use may not have been directly responsible for the death of Pula's fetus. Nonetheless, after deliberating for less than 3 hours, a jury found her guilty, and she was sentenced to 4 years in prison. I can't explain this. This never should have happened. Brittany is a Native American. This may have been a factor. Brittany was not well represented. This was most definitely a factor. Brittany is poor. This was a factor. Most likely the biggest factor was prejudice regarding her drug use. She's a druggie. She must be guilty. She intentionally used drugs. She must be guilty. Back to the question that we set aside, as this is a huge can of worms. Was her fetus a person? The Oklahoma Civil Court of Criminal Appeals discussed this very issue a year earlier, and a very similar scenario to Brittany's was suggested by the defendant there as a possibility. The case is State v. Green, where the defendant, Catherine Green, was convicted of child neglect for maliciously failing to protect her child from exposure to illegal drugs. She gave birth to a stillborn baby and discarded it in a box in a dumpster. There are two major differences in the two cases. In the Green case, the coroner determined that the cause of death was methamphetamine. Second, Green's baby was found to be a viable fetus prior to death. Green argued that her fetus was not a child under the Oklahoma criminal statutes. The court disagreed. Green argued that in Burns v. Alcala, the United States Supreme Court determined that dependent child does not include the unborn. When two women were denied benefits under the Aid to Families with Dependent Children, as their unborn children did not qualify. In Burns, the court said that a dependent child must have a separate existence and have been born alive. Green also cited Starks v. State, in which the Oklahoma Supreme Court ruled that the unborn could not be found to be a dependent child for the purpose of taking that child into custody. This is the scenario that I foresee as a major issue with the Pula case. The court in Green said these two cases don't apply, as they don't rule on whether Oklahoma's criminal law protects an unborn child from the specific acts of neglect at issue here. Rather, the court turned to Hughes v. State, where the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals abandoned the common law born alive rule and held that an unborn viable fetus is a human being. Thus, current Oklahoma law clearly protects unborn children from homicide. Second, 12 years after the holding in Hughes, the legislature amended the statute, going even further than Hughes and making it clear that human being includes an unborn child, as defined in Section 1730 of Title 63 of the Oklahoma statutes. Section 1-730 subsection 4 in turn defines unborn child as the unborn offspring of human beings from the moment of conception through pregnancy and until live birth, including the human conceptus, zygote, morula, blastocyst, embryo, and fetus. Green argued that the intent was to protect the unborn from acts of third parties, not from acts of the mother. Green suggested to the court the very scenario in the Pula case as the rationale for finding this way. The court rejected Green's argument, saying that Oklahoma clearly protected against a case like Brittany's, as it is specifically excluded from the definition of homicide, Oklahoma 21-691 subsection D. Under no circumstances shall the mother of an unborn child be prosecuted for causing the death of the unborn child unless the mother has committed a crime that caused the death of the unborn child. Yet that is exactly where we stand today. There is no evidence that Brittany Pula caused the death of her unborn child, yet she was convicted of manslaughter. Pula's case is an injustice, but it is also a warning. This is what happens when the law treats embryos and fetuses as people with rights that supersede the rights of those who carry them. And it offers a glimpse into the sort of prosecutions that could become common in a world in which Roe v. Wade is overturned, one we could be living in as soon as next year. But the Oklahoma court clearly violated their own definition of what is a homicide in this case. I think Brittany's case will eventually be overturned on appeal. But in the meantime, Brittany's been in jail or in prison since March of 2020. Years of her life that should never have been denied her. Second, I note the incongruity that the unborn are persons for the purpose of finding that a woman is guilty of a crime, but that same unborn entity is not a person when it comes to helping support a woman's pregnancy. We can punish a woman for not caring for her unborn, but we can't help her. No welfare benefits for this person. No tax deduction for this person, because it isn't a person. But if any harm comes to the unborn, suddenly they are persons. My next concern is that women will be prosecuted for improper disposal of dead bodies in the case of a miscarriage. Section 21-1152 states duty of burial, except in cases in which a right to dissect a dead body is expressly conferred by law. Every dead body of a human being must be decently buried within a reasonable time after death. Since Oklahoma has defined a human being as including all unborn, including a zygote, a fertilized egg that has not implanted, what is a woman's duty when she has a miscarriage? Does she need to collect any expelled tissue and bring it to a funeral home? She can, but in most states it's actually illegal to transport a body without a permit. Can she bury it at home? Maybe. It depends on local rules. But if she fails to bury it, she can be convicted of a crime. Section 21-1159, neglect of burial. Every person upon whom the duty of making the burial of the remains of a deceased person is imposed by law, who omits to perform that duty within a reasonable time, is guilty of a misdemeanor. But this wouldn't be limited to miscarriages. Since a zygote is a human being under Oklahoma law, it also must have a decent burial. I guess everyone that has periods must save all those used hygiene products for burial, just in case. They could contain human remains. Imagine the job of the police finding human remains in hygiene products. And while this is hyperbole, as I don't expect anyone would actually arrest a woman for disposing of a used napkin without burying it, under the current Oklahoma law, this is technically the requirement.
We're only saying you're doing fine, Oklahoma.
Which is why I say Oklahoma is not okay. People, this is ridiculous. A zygote is not a person. But there is a second effect beyond the legal ramifications of this case that are just as problematic. That is the medical issues raised here, which is why the National Perinatal Association said it opposes any legal measures that involve the criminal justice system when someone is pregnant. Lest you think that this is an isolated incident, it is not. In 2013, a peer-reviewed study by the National Association for Pregnant Women, a reproductive justice organization, found 413 cases from 1973 to 2005 of women arrested or otherwise deprived of liberty because they were accused of endangering or harming their fetuses. Since then, the pace of prosecutions has escalated. Between 2006 and 2020, the National Advocates for Pregnant Women identified 1,254 such cases. The growing number of these kinds of cases has a chilling effect on women seeking medical care while pregnant. Women with high-risk pregnancies find themselves in a catch-22 situation where if they get medical help, they can be accused of doing something to cause their own miscarriage, and if they seek no care, they are more likely to actually contribute to their own miscarriage. To discuss the medical ramifications of this case, I have asked student Dr. Ben to join me. Ben? Welcome, student Dr. Ben. Thank you so much for joining me, and thank you for helping me out with some of the medical aspects of this problem.
Yeah, I'm super happy to be here. Super excited to finally do a video with Godless Granny. You're a favorite in the community. I'm just pretty excited to be on your show.
Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm student Dr. Ben. I'm a third-year medical student in the United States. I'm also a trans guy, and I make videos on YouTube on medicine and kind of the overlap with social issues going on, namely within transgender issues. But then recently, I've been making a series on abortion laws and why they can be kind of a problem for people who have medical reasons why they might have an abortion or a miscarriage. And so it makes sense that I would be brought on for this type of video.
Brittany Pula was arrested and convicted for misdemeanor manslaughter, first-degree manslaughter for causing a death during the commission of a misdemeanor, and the misdemeanor being the possession and use of methamphetamine. I've already talked about the legal ramifications of this case, but let's talk about the medical ramifications. What will this kind of a case do, first of all, to women who need medical care for being pregnant?
Yeah, this causes a lot of problems. Many people don't have access to prenatal care, and this is a huge problem. And a lot of the complications with pregnancy are because people aren't able to get prenatal care. And especially if you're throwing on the stigma associated with substance abuse and substance abuse issues, people aren't willing to report now because there's consequences to them being on these substances. So they're going to be more afraid to seek out help because they're worried they're going to be convicted of things like this. So, like, really, what we need to do is destigmatize this kind of thing so that people feel like they are able to get help and that they aren't going to be reported for seeking help. Because if people are afraid to get this help, then they're going to go to other means of handling their problems on their own, which can end up being more dangerous in the long run for both of them. Pregnancy is not benign in any way. Like, most of the time, due to modern healthcare practices, we're able to have most pregnancies end in success. However, it's very dangerous. And if you're not able to screen for things early on and you're not able to control very common issues with pregnancy, it can be fatal for both the mother or the gestating parent as well as the fetus.
Do you foresee that something like this could have an effect not only on someone who's involved in criminal activity, but even women who aren't involved in any kind of criminal activity, but maybe are just have a high-risk pregnancy?
Absolutely. This causes a lot of problems, especially because the assumption that this meth use had caused the miscarriage and the lack of evidence to support that they were related causes a problem. It kind of shows that people aren't concerned as much about the miscarriage, they're concerned about the meth use. The evidence shown by the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, so I'll refer to them as ACOG, I looked up what they had to say about methamphetamine in pregnancy. And the big issue is the correlation between methamphetamine use and placental abruption, which placental abruption typically occurs after 20 weeks of gestation, which in this specific court case, I believe it was at 17 weeks.
Yes.
This happened.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So placental abruption normally wouldn't happen at this stage anyway. But apart from that, there really isn't a strong association of meth use and developmental abnormalities. Kind of the biggest issue that they can actually support is having a fetus that is small for gestational age. But otherwise, having developmental abnormalities such as like brain damage or heart damage, they're correlated, but there isn't really a causal relationship proven because the studies have been limited. They've had small sample sizes and there are too many variables to account for. So there are many things that can cause these kinds of developmental issues to happen, and they haven't been strongly associated with methamphetamine use. So the only thing we could really go off of is the placental abruption, which again, she's too early to really meet the standard time frame for a placental abruption. But placental abruption can be caused by a number of different medical conditions. One of the main causes is high blood pressure. And So let's say you have somebody who has already had high blood pressure for most of their life, and they get switched onto a medication that is safe in pregnancy, like labetalol is one of the more commonly used blood pressure medications used in pregnancy. It is known to be safe. But if they stop taking their labetalol and they have a high blood pressure spike, they can cause a placental abruption. So they could have the same thing that we're worried about with methamphetamine. So we're blurring a line here. So if you're going to convict somebody for meth use potentially causing a placental abruption and you're calling that manslaughter, then do we do the same thing for someone who stops taking their blood pressure meds and has the same result? Is the result the issue, or is it the meth use that was the issue?
Right, exactly, exactly. It's like they're trying to find a way to punish her twice because she was pregnant.
Absolutely.
Mhm. Can't placental abruption also be the result of trauma?
It can.
Uh-huh.
It can. One of the frequent causes is car accidents can cause placental abruption.
Falling down the stairs or being in a car accident causing you a placental abruption. I could foresee a woman being charged with manslaughter because she ran a red light and had a miscarriage as a result.
Yeah, absolutely. There's in blurring this line, it's causing a lot more issues for everybody involved. People finding ways to convict the physicians as a result of someone's miscarriage because they think it was an abortion. Because when we use the term abortion, that just means an ending of pregnancy before 20 weeks. That's an abortion. So regardless
Okay.
of whether or not it was intentional, it's still an abortion. So like if a doctor prescribes somebody labetalol for their high blood pressure, they stop taking it and then they had a miscarriage, could the doctor then be responsible as well because they weren't hammering it hard enough into their patient's head that they needed to take their labetalol, that they weren't being medically compliant? How do they determine responsibility in these cases?
That's a very good question. And since one of the targets of the pro-life movement has been doctors, I could definitely foresee them going after doctors for this kind of thing. You raised another question in my mind. You mentioned that it's only an abortion if it's before 20 weeks. What do you call it after 20 weeks?
After 20 weeks, it is a delivery, and it does not matter if the fetus is alive or not. After 20 weeks, it is a delivery. So it might be a stillbirth or it might be a live delivery, but it's a delivery. If someone goes in for an induction, like that's the same process. So even if the baby has died in utero and you need to get it out, you're going to induce in the same way that you would for somebody having an induced delivery.
Okay. If the fetus is not viable, say it's a 30-week fetus, but it maybe it's a hydrocephalic baby and
Mhm.
you know that the baby's not viable, you still call it a delivery?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, so the terminology here is for any ending of pregnancy, it's based on the weeks. So before 20 weeks, whether or not it was intentional is an abortion. If whether or not it's intentional after 20 weeks, it's a delivery. But then we separate it out. If it is intentional in any way, it's called a termination. That's not only for just ending the pregnancy because they want to end the pregnancy. That could also be a termination related to something like preeclampsia, where you need to end a pregnancy before just a spontaneous delivery because you need to save them both. So even if you're trying to spare the life of the fetus that you're delivering, it's still a termination because you're non-spontaneously ending the pregnancy.
Okay, that's interesting. Any other thoughts on any effects that you foresee from this type of scenario?
The fact that people aren't going to be willing to seek care. And something else too is, are we really putting the burden on somebody who's not medically trained to know what's beneficial or not for their baby if they're not getting prenatal care? These people, like, they're lay people, most of them. They may or may not know what compounds are going to be toxic to their baby. And there are a lot of things that aren't recreational drugs that are toxic to pregnancies. And one of these is vitamin A, can cause birth defects and certain mutations in the DNA that can be problematic. And so oftentimes if you're getting like an acne treatment that has vitamin A, you need to be on birth control because of the fear of mutagenesis in your baby. So if someone just doesn't know that and they take a whole ton of vitamin A during their pregnancy, are we really making them responsible for not knowing that vitamin A can cause that? That's not within their scope of education. We can't expect that of people unless they get the health care that they need. So I'd say we need to stop penalizing people for not knowing and provide better access to education on the subject and better access to healthcare, because really, in order to keep people safe, criminalizing them is not the answer. The answer is education and preventative care.
One other result that I could foresee is an increase in abortions.
Oh, absolutely.
If women are afraid that carrying a pregnancy to term is going to get them put in jail, you're better off with an abortion.
Yeah, and usually an unsafe one, because if they go to a provider to get an abortion, then they could also be at risk for being reported and also being convicted on grounds that they sought an abortion. So that might lead to an increase in DIY at home unsafe abortions that can be even more dangerous to everybody involved.
Okay, those are all the questions that I had for you, Dr. Ben. Thank you very much for coming.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was a great conversation.
Live your life.